Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm glad to have you here. Just a couple items that I wanted to let you know. This is Anne from the CARA Association. I apologize for not having video. We're having a little technical difficulty here at the office today as we change a few computer processes. But I wanted to let you know that at the end of the presentation, Attorney Bellavia will have time we'll take questions. So if you have questions, please use the Q&A function at that time to type them in. You can get that by usually hovering over the bottom of your Zoom screen. And with that, I'd like to give you a little background about our presenter today. Attorney Leonard Bellavia is the founding partner of the law firm of Bellavia Blatt. He is a nationally recognized attorney in all things dealer related. Okay, he is a regularly quoted source of comment for automotive news, and he's also a regular speaker for national automotive trade associations across the country like ours. He's a member of the board of directors for the National Association of Dealer Counsel, and has also served as chairman of its litigation division. Recently, also, Attorney Bellavia was honored as the 2021 top franchise lawyer on Long Island by the Long Island Herald, and was also selected to the 2022 list of New York super lawyers for franchise and dealership law. With 3 locations in neighboring New York, his practice extends to cover aspects of real estate, federal and state court litigation, automotive franchise law, dealership buy-sell transactions, and all dealership corporate matters. Len has been instrumental in negotiating the sale of hundreds of dealerships, and we are very lucky to have him speak to us today on the state of the industry as it relates to buy-sell transactions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Attorney Len Bellavia.
And thank you very much. I appreciate being invited, and always good to work with the dealers in Connecticut. The landscape has changed dramatically over the past 12 months or so. So I thought it would be a good time to explore where we've been, where we are, and project where I think we're going to be going, both in terms of buy-sells and also the franchise business model framework, because they're both interrelated. The buy-sells are a function of the desirability of the franchises in the first place. So much is going on in the industry that it's probably appropriate that we visit both what's happening specifically as it relates to buy-sells and what's driving purchases and sales of dealerships. So I guess we'll start out with where we are. Where we are is now approximately 2 years post-pandemic, and what started out as gloom and doom has turned into some of the most profitable 2 years in the automotive industry in terms of net income per rooftop. So that has driven buyers into the marketplace. There's an awful lot of money that's on the sidelines waiting to be employed to buy dealerships, and that has resulted in unexpected but increased activity on the M&A scene. So brokers and dealership lawyers and dealership accountants, lenders, everybody involved in the M&A world have been very busy over the past 2 years. At the same time, auto manufacturers have been trying to figure out how to transition to both electric vehicles and advanced technology in terms of how to keep buyers happy in a world that is now dominated by digital purchasing. So with so much going on, it's very difficult for the so-called experts in the industry to figure out, how to execute valuations of dealerships. Execution of valuations has traditionally been relatively straightforward and simple. All dealers have been familiar with the multiple of earnings calculation of dealership blue sky. That's still a valid way to appraise a dealership, but there are so many footnotes to it that it's no longer a straightforward calculation, and I'll go into that a little bit in explaining how valuations are being accomplished. So with that, let's discuss whether or not the headline here still applies. Is the current buy-sell market still red hot? I speak to dealership attorneys on a regular basis. I know all of the brokers out there, lenders. We have our own our own practice group for buy sell. So I would characterize it as not necessarily red hot right now. I think it's certainly more than lukewarm. Maybe we'll call it moderately hot for lack of wanting to get pinned down. And the reason I say that is when you listen to these presentations by various constituencies, brokers are busy because I don't know if they follow or lead, but they're very busy because they're still dealing with pending matters. So from their perspective, I'm sure they'll report to you that it's still a red hot market. When the documents, or when I should say, the proposed transactions get to the lawyers' desks, we can pretty much gauge startup. When you measure the housing market, it's all about new construction. So I'll talk about this in terms of new buy sells. And I can tell you that from the experience in my office and other attorneys that I regularly speak with, it has slowed down somewhat. And I think the explanation for that is probably well known by dealers, and that is that there's some uncertainty in the economy right now. But more than that, I think the real reason is sellers have had at least a year and a half to pull the trigger on entering into the marketplace and selling their dealerships. Sellers have known now for 18 months that blue sky values have been through the roof. So anyone that has toyed with the idea of selling and made some decisions have probably executed on that by now. So that's why I think we're not seeing as much activity. And this is akin to the housing market. If you talk to mortgage brokers, when interest rates are really low, the assumption is they're busy with refis. But their explanation is that when interest rates get very low for a long period of time, they could still be slow because most people have taken advantage of the low interest rates as soon as they have floored. So once you've saturated the refi market, you're still going to have activity, but not as much as at the outset. And the same holds true with dealership buy sells. Most of the sellers who've said they're never going to see blue sky multiples as high as they've seen recently have entered the market and sold their dealerships. That is not to say that there aren't sellers out there. The sellers now, I think, fit into certain categories, driven by illness or retirement, maybe some family issues, divorces. So the traditional motivators or catalysts are multiples, high blue sky numbers, and that ship has sailed, but the multiples are still very high, but they're being tempered. And they're being tempered pretty much because sellers are now are getting a sense of what their dealerships are worth. So the second bullet point here is unrealistic sellers. That is the bane of a dealership broker's existence. Sellers now think they can get 15 times earnings when even if that were true, buyers are pretty sophisticated. The kind of buyers that can afford to pay 10 million or more for a dealership are pretty sophisticated people. So they know that, for example, we're getting to the point now where we're in the middle of 2022, and you really can't start looking back to pre-COVID years of 2018 and 2019. They're becoming more and more stale, and the circumstances related to inventory availability have kind of taken over what's considered normal. So in 2020, everybody was talking about pre-COVID net earnings, and that was a realistic way to go about evaluating the price of a dealership. But now, fast forward, we're 2 years since we're back in business, and we have new issues coming up: chip shortages and related components. Then more recently, we have inflation and gas prices. So if you sit down around a table with experts in dealership valuations, whether they be brokers, CPAs, or appraisers themselves, dealership attorneys, it's not so easy anymore. It used to be, well, is Toyota worth 6 times net earnings or 7 or 5, and we could grapple with that. Now the discussion is what is going to be the impact of high fuel costs? What about the advent of EVs and the intended growth in market share? What about the different programs that auto manufacturers are discussing now related to direct sales or reservation systems, or the sudden advent of vehicle information being available to consumers online. So there's a whole host of categories that go into a dealership valuation now that make it difficult for both buyers and sellers to figure out what's a reasonable asking price. And obviously, if you go too high, if you're asking, multiples that aren't justified, there's a negative stigma associated with that dealership if it doesn't get into contract right away. So what used to be a relatively straightforward exercise of getting to a buy-sell has now become a little attenuated in terms of figuring out what is a fair price to ask for the dealership. You certainly don't want to ask too low based on the fear factor of potentially what may be coming down the road in terms of manufacturer initiatives. And at the same time, you don't want to undersell your dealership because right now the profitability of dealerships is still very strong. It's starting to wane a little bit based on product availability issues. And some consumers are pushing back at paying more than list price. They're getting a little tired of that. So things I think are going to start to level off. And then you have the uncertainty related to the economy. So that kind of brings us to this page, which we could spend a couple hours on these bullet points alone. But I'm going to try and go through them and address some of these issues and in terms of how they relate to the buy-sell activity that we're dealing with right now. So factory intrusions, right? That's the new headline. The overall impact of factory intrusions on buy-sell activity. So let's talk about that. There's been discussion now, particularly with Ford and Volkswagen, Volvo, and the others are not too far off. I know GM has already implemented a program with the Hummer where direct sales are now being promoted and actually implemented. So the question becomes, what happens to the franchise model if manufacturers implement these programs where consumers now are going to be dealing directly with the manufacturer in terms of pricing and dealing with trade-ins? That issue has gotten dealers quite concerned because the question remains, well, what is the gross profit going to be on the sale of those vehicles? And manufacturers have not been forthcoming in terms of what the average gross profit per new unit sold will be under a direct sale model. And this all presumes that auto manufacturers will actually be permitted to go forward with these plans. I've been speaking lately on the subject in a franchise law context on whether auto manufacturers are even permitted to go down that road. And to make a long story very short, because that also could be the subject of a multi-hour presentation, but franchise laws in just about every state prohibit auto manufacturers from engaging in the sales of new vehicles. So, what's a sale? At what point does factory involvement constitute engaging in the sale of motor vehicles? Is it just the display and information? Well, no. And manufacturers have historically been putting information on their websites about features of a vehicle, but they've always left the pricing and the negotiation of the price to the franchise dealer. That paradigm is shifting if it's to be left up to the auto manufacturers. However, if dealers decided that they wanted to put a stop to it, they have the legal ability to do so because the franchise laws in each state delineate what the province of the franchise dealers are, and that is that only franchise dealers can sell vehicles. And once you start negotiating prices or setting prices and interacting directly with consumers and talking about trade-ins and potentially items of after sale, then manufacturers are engaging in what is the protected province of a dealer. So that remains to be seen over the next 6 to 12 months. Will dealers push back on factory intrusion into the retailing of vehicles? If dealers don't push back and manufacturers are permitted to go unfettered into the marketplace and deal directly with consumers, the next step is to figure out where does that leave the dealer? Manufacturers are saying, don't worry to the dealers, they'll still be permitted to deliver the vehicle. But there's been no discussion of how much money how much the margin will be that's remaining for the dealer. Right now, dealers, as we all know, front and back end, are making record grosses per new unit sold. If that's truncated by 50% and supply is limited, well, dealers are surviving based on limited supply because they need to raise prices so they can cover the overhead. So if they're given limited vehicles and their gross profits are substantially minimized, then you can rest assured that's going to have a negative impact on the valuation of a dealership going forward. The second bullet point, I'm kind of giving you the negative side of valuation right now, and then I'll explain why you might want to disregard all of these potential negative impacts. And this all goes to what school of thought that you subscribe to. So I'll get to that in a few minutes, but let's go over the second bullet point, the connected vehicles, over the airways, over the air updates. And what I'm speaking about there is the ability of much like your cell phone, the ability of consumers to update their features in their cars, such as navigation systems, heated steering wheels, heated seats, other features that can be activated via the internet. And how does that translate to the daily activity of a dealership? Well, if manufacturers now start shipping cars or manufacturing cars in skeleton format, and I'm going to exaggerate a little bit just to drive home the point, but if vehicles start arriving at dealerships that have only standard equipment and consumers can decide whether they want to subscribe to these over-the-air updates, then they can do so not at delivery, but they could wait a year or 2 years or however long they want to start subscribing to those programs and then paying additional money to the manufacturer. These vehicles, the vehicles that are being sold now, are called connected vehicles. So that's going to be a term of art in the auto industry pretty soon. So connected vehicles gives rise to these over-the-air updates, so that dealers now are going to be stripped of the opportunity to sell features that are normally part of the gross margin between cost and sticker. So all of the popular features that are now available to consumers over the airways might not be part of the spread between cost and list price when a vehicle arrives at the dealership. So what that essentially means is dealers will be selling vehicles at minimum profit margins, and then the increase, if you want to call this after sale, it's a new form of after sale, will be enjoyed only by the manufacturers and not the dealers. Now, West Virginia has been one state that has been proactive in trying to address this. They introduced a bill that required that dealers participate in the gross profit of any of those over-the-air upgrades that consumers ultimately subscribe to. In its final form, there was a compromise there, and dealers were able to participate only to the extent a consumer came into the dealership to activate some of these subscriptions. So I'm only raising that to show that dealer associations are starting to address this. But if you consider that this potentially is more meaningful and more impactful to dealers than even EVs. EVs represent right now 5% of the market. There's a lot of discussion over the next 5 to 10 years whether their market share will be 10% or 20%. But the point to be made here is that connected vehicles right now are about 90 or even closer to 100% of vehicles on the market right now, ICE vehicles. So connected vehicles and over-the-air updates are actually more of a threat to the franchise system than direct sales are of electric vehicles. So why is this relevant in a buy-sell discussion? Because if manufacturers are permitted to move forward, selling cars to dealers that have only the bare bones and the margins are therefore downwardly compressed, so the per unit net profit to dealers, even assuming they have control of the customer, compound that with a direct sale model, and it doesn't seem like there's a lot of meat on the bone for dealers on the sales of vehicles. Add to that EVs. Once EVs begin getting higher market share, your fixed operations are going to be affected because there aren't enough, there's not as many moving parts in an electric vehicle to result in high warranty parts and labor revenues. So to take a look at this cynically, and this is why buyers potentially are being advised by their accountants and advisors not to stick with high multiples, because the short-term future has all of these roadblocks. So buyers have to be extremely cautious now in deciding whether they want to offer multiples of 6, 7, 8 of current net profits. So there are so many adjustments that need to be made to a dealership valuation. Again, I'm not saying that it's still not a hot market, but buyers are becoming more sophisticated because now they have to add to their formula all of these different calculations of what the potential return on investment is. So multiples are no longer the flavor of the year in valuing dealerships. There are too many potential issues that would either impact negatively or with a little good faith, maybe not impact it as much. The other side of the coin here is those buyers who are still going to be willing to pay high prices based upon the fact that there are franchise laws that would prevent all of this from happening. So they're betting on the fact that either dealers or dealer associations or dealer advocates will keep this in check, and therefore the retail franchise model will not be negatively impacted. Perhaps they're viewing the incoming electric vehicle market as not being a major factor. They don't feel that there's going to be a lot of market share there, and even if there is, they think they could make enough money on those vehicles. So those that look at the glass half full will probably not be negatively discouraged from offering the same type of multiples here. The agency model is something that's also been under discussion that is concerning to buyers and sellers. The agency model is a term that came out of Europe that reflects what's going on in those countries, although the dealership model there is much different. European dealers do not have the same franchise laws that American dealers have. So it's a little bit of a fiction when people talk about, well, dealers in the United States are going to be subject to the agency model. But keep in mind, that only assumes that dealers will invoke their rights under the 50-state franchise laws and put a stop to the agency model. The other thing that I think some dealers are finding comfort in is that even those manufacturers that are being very progressive about direct sales and connected vehicles and so forth, to the extent that they go down that road and they find that they're losing market share to those manufacturers who are not being so aggressive, changing the model in such a radical way, well, then they'll probably reverse themselves, because in the end, it's all about market share. And while they may try these new radical methods to retail vehicles and challenge the franchise system, it all may become moot if it's not working for them and they have to retrench. The dealers, the present 17,000 dealers across the country, I think will be looking at their state associations and NADA and their dealer councils on a more regular basis to try and get them to fight back, to push back against some of these factory initiatives that don't really have a clear picture for dealers. Going back to the agency model, that might be a perfectly fine model if manufacturers were willing to pay dealers the same gross profit that they're enjoying now. In theory, this may be pie in the sky, may not be realistic, but if manufacturers decided that this was worth it, they wanted to take the dealer out of the retail picture, as long as they pay dealers at least $5,000 per unit sold, dealers now can reduce their overhead, right? They don't need the same sales force. They don't need a sales manager. So there are economies of scale that could be injected into that formula such that an agency model could work. But dealers will tell you that manufacturers are never going to be that generous. And even if they start out that way to try and get dealers to buy into the agency model, they're not going to continue that commitment long term. There'll come a point where they pull back. And then it would be too late for a dealer to do anything about it because he's already foregone his rights under the franchise laws to object to an agency model. And that's why the roles of state and national dealer associations and dealer councils, in my view, are going to become all the more important over the next several months than they've ever been. All right, so let's skip now to those dealers who are considering selling and the things they have to consider before they actually decide the direction they're going to go in. So first question is obviously, why are you selling? As I said earlier, those that really wanted to capitalize on the multiples have probably already done so. But obviously, people are still aging, circumstances change. Those that want to now start on their retirement plans are going to sell. There's always people retiring. Those that are suffering from an illness and don't have family to take over for them, they will be in the market to sell their dealerships. There are those that have come into the business, let's say within the past 5 or 7 years, and decided to buy dealerships solely to turn them around and sell them at a profit. So it's strictly a short-term play. Well, the time is right for them now. They've built up enough profit and loss. Some dealers have been hesitating to sell because they're enjoying such record-breaking profits that they've decided to continue to operate the business and then make the move at the very last minute. So I think you're going to find those type of sellers out there. So that's why I didn't say that I think the market is cold. It should be cold because there's been 2 years of opportunity for sellers to take advantage of these multiples. But a lot of dealers have decided to stay in the game and enjoy these profits for as long as they can. And I think you're going to start seeing dealers who say, all right, I think the bloom is going to be off the rose soon because there are too many unknowns now between gas prices, inflation, and all the things we already talked about, and of course, factory initiatives. So maybe now is the time to throw their hat in the ring. So this is where I agree with a lot of the brokers who say that, we are not yet peaked at the number of transactions that we're going to see in 2022 and maybe into 2023. So it's an unknown. There's too many arguments both ways. I can just tell you that from my point of view as a person who drafts buy sells, it seems to be slowing down, but I don't know that that's going to be a continuing trend. It may actually pick up again once dealers realize that the future is getting uncertain, and maybe now is the time for them to cash in their chips. Let's talk about alternatives to selling. The auto retail, ownership of an auto dealership is rather interesting. It's unique. It's the type of business, and younger people who are tech savvy are realizing this. I have clients who pretty much run their dealerships on remote control. They're not physically in the dealerships. They take advantage of technology and they're able to do an effective job. So if those skill sets can be transferred to people who would ordinarily, to dealers who would ordinarily be ready to retire, those dealers can implement those technologies. What I really mean by that is find people and throw money, throw resources at skilled people who can enable them to continue to earn high net profits while they're in Florida sitting under a palm tree somewhere. It can be done, and I find now that a lot of dealers are saying, listen, I don't want to sell, I don't want to continue working so hard, and I'm willing, if I'm making $2 million or $3 million a year, I'm willing to spend an extra $300,000 in salaries to get the right people in place so that rather than cashing in my chips, I can still continue to earn these high net profit figures while at the same time enjoying a quasi-retirement. So I'm finding that there's a lot of transitioning that's going on in piecemeal fashion where dealers are not retiring in full, but they're just going into a couple of different phases before they officially totally retire. And that sounds easy. The challenge really is to find management that you can trust, that's honest, that's going to run the dealership the way the retiring, quote unquote, retiring dealer wants it to be run. And what I've advised dealers in that situation to do is to budget for an experienced accounting firm to effectively babysit the dealership on a monthly basis. Same thing for an experienced attorney, to have advisors that are going to be in the dealership to monitor the activity on a regular basis. And sure, that may cost several $100,000 a year, but if you consider what you're getting for that money, the ability to quasi-retire, and also continue to earn record-breaking figures. So if you think the market is not going to be negatively impacted and you're going to be making under this new special ordering system versus having large inventories, and you think that's portends the future, then you're better off finding a team to continue to run the dealership continue to make these profits and at the same time back off the day-to-day as much as possible. The next bullet point here is finding buyers. Finding buyers really goes to whether you try and sell the dealership through your contacts, meaning your lenders, your attorneys, your accountants, or whether you go to market through a dealership broker. I'm a proponent of listing with an experienced dealership broker, primarily for the reason that it ensures, or as much as possible, ensures confidentiality. Once you tell someone at the manufacturer, the OEM, or an accountant, not so much an accountant or a lawyer, they have oaths of confidentiality, but a lender, a key person at the dealership, if you call a neighboring dealer who you think might be interested, that's how these things get leaked out. And the problem with getting these facts leaked out is it creates uncertainty in terms of your staff, and you don't want people leaving your dealership for fear of you selling the store. So I find that brokers provide that level of confidentiality. Usually the process goes along a little faster because they usually have portfolios of qualified candidates that they have pre-vetted, so that the time frame for you between listing and getting an offer will be reduced. And usually they earn their commission, I feel, even though the inclination is to try and save the commission. I think dealers wind up doing much better in the long run by having someone at their side that can speak to them and also give some reason, because dealers always seem to want more than the dealership is worth. It's always good to have a broker as a sounding board, and you can use the broker alongside your accountant and your attorney to get a consensus of opinion on whether your proposed buyer is someone worth pursuing. So I'm an advocate for listing it and preserving the confidentiality of the intended transaction. Now, here's something that there might be some divergence of opinion between brokers and attorneys. Brokers typically, once they find a buyer, like to have a letter of intent drafted so that it essentially takes the dealership off the market. It gives the buyer a sense of obligation, and it gives the seller a sense of commitment. The reason that I find, as a person who drafts buy-sell agreements, I find letters of intent a little bit of an unnecessary step. I can appreciate the idea of wanting to get the buyer and the seller psychologically committed to each other. But in my experience, I find that the amount of legal work that goes into drafting a letter of intent is not much different than the amount of time and energy it takes to draft the actual buy-sell agreement, what we call the APA, or the asset purchase agreement. So you're actually creating another step. And one of the things that brokers and sellers are trying to work around is the delay that usually comes when you get the attorneys involved. But I find that if the attorney on the other side for the buyer and the attorney for the seller are experienced in dealership transactions, they can produce a contract, negotiate it, and get it finalized in the same amount of time that it takes a letter of intent. A letter of intent in theory is a short document, maybe just a few pages, as compared to a 30-page asset purchase agreement. So the assumption is that that'll go along much more quickly as a first step, and then phase two will be to negotiate the 30-page document. But those people who draft agreements for a living will tell you it's harder to put the thoughts of both parties in a 3-page document than it is a 30-page document. You have to work a lot harder to keep it brief and succinct. And also, when you start negotiating a letter of intent, you're talking about the same issues as you are in the asset purchase agreement. So ultimately what happens is, if you're representing a seller, you're going to wind up giving a legal bill, professional bill, for twice the amount of hours. So it's more cost efficient. As a general rule, I will tell you this: if I'm a buyer, if I'm representing a buyer and I think the asset purchase agreement, based on who the seller's attorney is, will take too long, then I'll recommend that we go into a letter of intent, because I'm the buyer and I want the seller to take it off the market. If I'm representing a seller, I don't want to take it off the market until I know that the buyer has written me a check for the down payment and it's officially signed up. So there's some competing interests there, depending on whether you're a buyer or a seller. But on the whole, at least from my experience, I think Asset purchase agreements can be produced in a matter of days, not much slower than a letter of intent, and it provides the finality that all of the parties want. So that's the preferred cost, excuse me, than wasting time with a letter of intent. All right, drafting the asset terms. Obviously, you want to keep the new vehicle inventory prominent. That's the most important asset being sold aside from the blue sky. These terms on this page have less meaning now than they did 3 years ago because the inventory levels at just about every dealership in the country are at a minimum based on the chip shortage. So typically, you list the definition of a new vehicle that's being sold. Typically, it's a current model year. So you want to define what a current model year is. And in traditional times, you had leftovers. There are no leftovers anymore. So you're really dealing with current model year, and usually that's invoice, less holdback, maybe you'll split the advertising costs. These can be negotiated, the co-op advertising. If the seller has performed pre-delivery inspection and has gotten paid for it, then the seller should be able to keep that. If he's gotten paid but hasn't performed any of the PDI, then that's a credit that would go to the buyer. Free interest, factory floor plan interest. Again, that's not as important nowadays as it used to be because cars are going in and out. But in regular times for the past 100 years, you had large inventories and you had to make adjustments for the interest that was remaining, the unaccrued free interest that manufacturers provided on the floor plan. That's really not an issue anymore. Maybe it will someday soon, but not in the next year probably. Pending orders. That is relevant because there are going to be a lot of factory orders that are on sold units that will come in after the closing. And the standard there is that those gross profits minus salesperson's commissions will get shared 50-50. Okay, used cars are not an obligation of the parties to buy or sell, but most buyers do want them. And what we typically provide is the week of the closing, the parties will walk the line, so to speak, car by car, and decide what they want to buy, what they don't want to buy. And if they can come to terms on those, then the buyer can cherry pick and the seller can then send the remaining vehicles to auction. Demos and loaners. Demos, you limit the amount of miles on the demos so the buyer doesn't wind up buying demos that have too high mileage. Also, you don't want the buyer to be saddled, and this applies to the seller too, with a sales tax liability, because if demos have too many miles on them, then sales tax is due. So you want to keep the number of miles on demos at a minimum, usually 4,000 miles or so. And this way the buyer's not purchasing too many demos and not running into a sales tax problem soon after the closing if the miles wind up accruing and no one's watching to see whether they go over the limit. All right, special tools. Buyers want a full set of special tools. Sellers may not have a full set. If I'm representing a seller, I'm saying, listen, whatever I have is what you're getting. We're not going to go out and spend more money for a full set of special tools. I think that's the fairer position to take than to require the seller to go out and spend extra money. So if I'm a buyer, I'm going to try and negotiate to get a full set of special tools. Parts and accessories, the cost of the inventory, which by the way should be done the weekend before the closing. The cost of that service should be split 50-50 between buyer and seller, and then you'll look on the repair orders to see whether any parts have been taken out of inventory between that weekend and the closing date, or if parts have been added for that matter. All right. Let's talk about the asset purchase agreement provisions relating to sellers and buyers' representations and warranties. So if I'm a buyer, I want to make sure the seller is going to put down affirmatively in the contract that he or she has not received any notices of deficiency from the manufacturer relating to anything: the facility, sales performance, CSI, service performance, anything that's normally measured, maybe not working capital, but any other factory deficiency notices the seller should be obligated to disclose that so the buyer can make an assessment of where that leaves them. If the buyer finds out that the manufacturer has been pressing the seller for an image upgrade, a facility image upgrade program, then the buyer is going to want to do some due diligence on what that means for him or her after the closing and whether the manufacturer is going to be applying pressure. And that's particularly important now when there's so much gray area in terms of direct selling, because if inventory levels are going to be low and consumers are not going to be coming in to buy cars, then you certainly don't want to sign up for an expensive image upgrade program if those programs, in fact, are going to be pushed by the manufacturers. Vehicle wholesaling and swapping. If I'm a buyer and I know the seller has multiple dealerships, I don't want to find out that he's swapping, desirable vehicles for undesirable vehicles so he can supply his other dealerships with the preferred model mix. Again, less important now than it was during the times when there were hundreds of vehicles on inventory. And you also want to be careful about assigning buyer's orders to other dealerships the seller may own of the same line make. So there's some due diligence that needs to be followed to make sure that it's business as usual between contract and closing as it relates to the new vehicle inventory, swapping, and any incoming sold orders. One thing I don't permit my seller, if I'm representing a seller, to do is to make representations as to past profit and general profitability. The financial statement of the seller is available to the buyer, typically through the broker, after the buyer signs a confidentiality and non-disclosure agreement. But we want representations as the seller's attorney that the buyer should not rely on anything in the financial statement. The buyer is presumably a sophisticated dealer, him or herself, and should be able to assess based on planning volume and historic sales, make their own objective projection of whether they will do better than the seller. But they certainly should not be in a position that if things don't go according to plan, that they should rely on representations and warranties of the seller as a basis to allege that there was some deception or fraud on the part of the seller. So we make clear, if I'm representing a seller, that the buyer is not relying on any representations or warranties relating to the profitability of the dealership. Vehicle equipment and accessories, again, less of a problem now. That generally dealt with add-ons, equipment that's added on. One thing that we've come across over the years is heavy truck dealers, Ford and Chevy and other truck dealers who are into the business of modifying trucks and adding a lot of accessories to trucks that are in stock. Again, there are no trucks in stock, so this becomes somewhat of a moot point. But if things get back to normal, then you don't want the seller loading up his pickup trucks with, $15,000 worth of extra equipment. Maybe he did well with that, but you don't want to be saddled with those type of inventory numbers remaining in inventory after the closing. Buyers, representations, and warranties. If I'm the seller, I want the buyer to represent that he's going to apply swiftly to the manufacturer. We typically require an application for franchise approval to be made within 2 weeks or so of the buy-sell being signed. Equally as important is making sure that the buyer diligently applies for Department of Motor Vehicles licensing. You certainly don't want to wait until the last minute and then find out that the closing is delayed. These two representations have led to some very unpleasant outcomes. If the deal collapses for whatever reason and the buyer then asks for his money back, a disgruntled seller will oftentimes say, I'm not giving you the down payment back because you didn't apply quickly to the manufacturer or to the Department of Motor Vehicles. And you might say, well, that had nothing to do with why the deal collapsed, but generally it does, because buyers will generally back out if they get the sense that the manufacturer is not going to approve them. So if the delay in providing data to the manufacturer is the reason for the turndown, the seller is not going to be too quick to return the down payment. And I've seen over the years a number of aborted buy-sells wind up in litigation over that issue. So the buyer should know that the seller is keeping his or her feet to the fire to get to the franchise approval stage. All right, non-compete covenants. what we want to stress here is that what is reasonable, what's not reasonable. If you're a seller and you're not planning on retiring, I mean, if you're totally in retirement, this doesn't really have that much meaning. But more and more sellers now who are taking advantage of these multiples, who are still in their earning years and plan on remaining in the auto business, want to be very careful about signing these non-compete covenants. The reasonable request for a non-compete is that the seller not work for, own, or operate another dealership of the same line make within the same geographic area or market area where the seller is located. So the seller, who may decide he wants to go work as a salesman or a manager to stay in the business after he sells the dealership, should be able to do so, provided it's not the same franchise that he or she is selling. Non-solicitation covenants pertain to, and these are very important if you're a buyer, you don't want the seller going to work somewhere else, even if it's at another brand, and solicit your technicians and your salespeople or your customers, because if you're a even though it may be a different line make and you have relationships with these customers who may be loyal to you, they may follow you. So you want to be careful as a buyer to make sure the seller signs up these non-solicitation covenant so that they're prescribed from taking or soliciting or poaching customers from the seller dealership. Next slide is real property. You want a fresh lease from the seller. If the seller owns the real estate, then you don't want an assignment of a lease that's existing between the seller-owned real estate entity and the dealership. You want a fresh lease, long-term, at least 10 years, with several options to renew. The options to renew can be shorter. They can be 5 years, maybe 2 5-year options, maybe a 15 and 2 5-year options. And this is an example of why letters of intent, I think, are problematic. It's much easier to negotiate an asset purchase agreement or the traditional buy-sell than it is a long-term real estate lease for the dealership facility. That requires, that's a living, breathing document that's going to survive potentially for 20 or 30 years after the closing. The buy-sell agreement lasts maybe 90 days and then it becomes extinct. So it's the lease that is the most important document in the buy-sell transaction. So what's the point of tying up a dealership and taking it off the market if you then have to sit down and negotiate a lease, a long-term lease? So the preferred method is, once you have a serious buyer and you get a term sheet, not a letter of intent, but a summary of all the deal terms from the broker, then you want to sit down and work out the long-term lease, escalations, rights to improve the facility, the insurance, risk of loss, all of the things that you find in a lease. They should be agreed to as early on in the process as humanly possible. Environmental issues, talking here about remediation. Most dealerships now seem to be in the 21st century, not a lot of underground lifts, but that doesn't mean there can't be some long-standing contamination that hasn't been addressed. The seller should have dealt with that before putting it on the market, but a buyer still has to do some due diligence, phase 1s and phase 2s. The point I wanted to make here is that there are formula that can be put into a buy-sell agreement that says, for example, once a contamination problem, or if a contamination problem is discovered during a phase 2, it's incumbent upon the seller to incur the cost of remediation up to a threshold, and let's say it's $500,000. So the first $500,000 should be at the seller's cost. Anything over that, then the parties can agree, if the buyer wants to. The buyer should have the right to walk at that point if he has to spend anything on environmental, but they can have a agreed to provision that says that the parties will agree that the next, let's say, $250,000 will be split evenly, 50-50 between the buyer and the seller. So the buyer might, in that case, be willing to spend an extra $125,000 if he really wants to move forward with the deal, even though it's not really the buyer's problem. And then anything over that, both the buyer and the seller should have the right to walk from the deal. So in my example, that would be $750,000. Those are just numbers. I threw them out simply to illustrate an example of how environmental remediation costs can be addressed with some reasonable expectation on both the buyer and the seller as to whether the deal will survive or not, depending on the extent of the remediation that's necessary. Once the dealership franchise approval is issued from the manufacturer, and that should be within 90 days. So you want to give the buyer a 90-day period. Most manufacturers have 60 days to reject or approve a buy-sell. So the first 30 days is for the buyer to get the application in and any supplemental information that the manufacturer asks for, therefore leaving those 60 days remaining for the manufacturer to approve or reject the transaction. And that's how we usually get to the 90 days. We can agree to adjournments, consensual adjournments, if it goes beyond that through neither the fault of the buyer or the seller, and we can agree on that in advance. But you want the factory to know that 90 days is a hard deadline so that they don't wind up dragging their feet. Once you get the approval, you want to close relatively quickly, and that should be within 10 days of receiving the approval. And you want to try and keep this quiet with respect to your employees. Most deals, though, it's almost impossible to do that, because once you're dealing with factories and floor plan lenders and DMS providers and all of the things that are necessary to get rolling before the closing, invariably the word gets out. And when it does get out, it's important that there be a meeting between the seller and the buyer and the key employees to address their concerns. And typically the buyer does not want to terminate the seller's employees. So it's equally as important for the buyer to have the employees stay on as it is for the seller to keep running a business until the day of closing. So the parties are typically aligned on that issue. But what you want to do for both parties' benefits is prevent key people from leaving because of the uncertainty. So once the cat's out of the bag, that meeting should be held as quickly as possible so that the status quo can be maintained. The OEM right of first refusal, that just simply means that you want to structure the agreement in a way that discourages the manufacturer from stepping in the shoes of the buyer and closing on the transaction, and therefore depriving the buyer of the ability to purchase the dealership. From the seller's point of view, money is money. So whether it comes from the buyer or the manufacturer, it doesn't really matter, except to the extent that the real estate is going to remain owned by the seller and is subject to a lease by the buyer. The seller is not going to want to take on a tenant that it's not comfortable with. So that's another reason for the seller to cooperate and trying to make the right of first refusal as unattractive to an auto manufacturer as possible. And the poison pills at the bottom of that page really refers to provisions that you can put in the asset purchase agreement that discourages the manufacturer from doing that. And typically that is to tie the real estate as closely to the transaction as possible. And that would mean the principal, real estate facility that the dealership sits on, any ancillary storage lots or facilities that are used in the dealership, because typically manufacturers do not want to be tied in long-term to facilities. And generally speaking, that is enough for a manufacturer to waive their right of first refusal. So when you're speaking with your attorney, ask them to put in several different poison pill provisions so that the deal can more likely get to a closing in the form that was originally intended. All right, just some quick closing considerations. You want the closing statement to have the vehicles and the parts clearly delineated, number of vehicles, the adjustments, the holdback, left side is the gross price for all these vehicles, the right side are the credits that the buyer is getting. You want the closing statement to be worked on long before the closing. There's no reason for a closing to go over, let's say, 4 hours. And every lawyer that's ever represented a dealer will tell you stories of how some of these closings went beyond 1 day or went into the wee hours of the morning. And the only reason for that to happen is the parties did not work together in concert to try and make it as seamless as possible. And oftentimes, you don't have control over it because there are too many people that are involved that you don't have access to, like lenders and floor plan checks, sales tax department. There's just so many players involved in the transaction that it's not always as try as you might not be able to get them all working together. But in a perfect world, you'll start the process about 3 or 4 days prior to the actual closing so that the adjustments, excuse me, can be agreed to in advance. Sales tax escrow, what that means is you want to go to the state and get clearance that the seller's sales tax liabilities are current so that the buyer doesn't inherit those liabilities. And if you don't get the sales tax escrow in time for the closing, the seller is going to want the buyer to put a lot of the, the buyer is going to want the seller to put a lot of the proceeds into an escrow account, keeping in mind that the buyer will become responsible if the sales tax clearance doesn't issue. So the seller is not going to be able to walk away with the full proceeds. And that amount could be substantial. So that's something that should be addressed very early on in the process. So by the time the closing date comes, the sales tax department will have already resolved this issue. Wire transfers now, closings are a little easier because most payments are made by wire. It used to be we'd have to wait for the buyer to go to the bank after all the adjustments are done and get bank checks, but that's from a bygone era. So logistical issues really relate to the seller and the buyer's bookkeeper. Those are the two most important people in the room. They're controllers or bookkeepers. They have to be working together days before the closing because the documents will have already been drafted by the lawyers. Most of the calculations, the key calculations, will have been done by the accountants, but the inventory, the parts, the work in process, payroll adjustments, that's all up to the bookkeeper / controller of the buyer and the seller, and they are the most important people in the room at the closing. So you don't want to wait until the morning of the closing to enlist their assistance. All right, so I think we covered quite a bit in a short period of time. I know we opened it up for some questions, so let's see if we have any questions. If you have questions, please type them in. We have a Q&A box there. I'll be happy to field them. So I'll wait a few seconds for you guys to send in questions if you have them. And if not, then we'll close it out after that. By the way, I'm going to put a slide on with our contact information. I think we have one. All right, so it's not there, but if anybody has questions over anything that I have discussed, it's very easy to get a hold of me. It's my first initial last name, lbelavia@dealerlaw.com. And the spelling is right on the top of that page. It's lbelavia@dealerlaw.com. Shoot me an email and I'll be more than happy to address any questions that you might have. All right.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Len. I really appreciate you doing this and a lot of great information again, as usual. And I just wanted to let everybody know too that to watch your emails because Len is going to continue his leadership series with us this fall. We're going to give everybody a break to take some vacations over the summer. But coming back in September and October, he's going to continue with keeping it all in the family and dealership succession and estate planning. So do some great topics for you to join in on. So I believe we will get a copy of the slides out to you, and it does include all Len's contact information on there. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.